waiver wire winners for fantasy football heading into Week 14. Both Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason are heading to the IR, which leaves rookie Isaac Guerrero as the new San Francisco starting running back. 10 rushing attempts for 99 yards back in Week 6, 14 rushing attempts for 85 yards and a touchdown in Week 8, a rushing touchdown in Week 13, and a big opportunity rest of season. Adam Thielen returned from injury in Week 12 after missing 7 games to catch 3 balls for 57 yards. In Week 13, he caught 8 of his 10 targets for 99 yards and a touchdown. Should have had a second touchdown, 23.9 fantasy points. People will forget that just last year with Bryce Young, who is trending up right now, he had 137 targets, 103 receptions, 1,014 receiving yards, and 13.6 fantasy points per game. 24.9, 19.1, and 27.9 fantasy weeks through 6 starts for Russell Wilson. 414 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception in Week 13. 10 passing touchdowns and 1 rushing through 6 games show some upside. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine is a touchdown monster, scoring 8 across the last 8 weeks. Double-digit fantasy points in 5 out of 6 of his last games. 3 catches on 8 targets for 61 yards and 2 scores in Week 13 for 21.1 fantasy points. 117 receiving yards back in Week 11. This could be an upside flex. In Week 13, Elijah Moore caught 8 of his 14 targets for 111 receiving yards and 19.2 fantasy points. A typo on my end, but in Week 11, Moore caught 6 of his 8 targets for 66 yards, a touchdown, and 18.6 fantasy points. And then back in Week 8, 8 catches on 12 targets for 85 yards and 16.5 fantasy points. So we are looking at 3 good examples of target volume paired with production attached to Jameis Winston. MVS back in Week 10, 3 catches for 109 yards, 2 touchdowns, 25.9 fantasy points. Then in Week 11, 2 catches for 87 yards, a touchdown, and 16.7 fantasy points. Week 13, 2 catches for 36 yards, but another touchdown, 11.6 fantasy points. Low volume, but high upside for the Saints in that Rashid Shaheed role. We mentioned him before, but Jameis Winston across the last 5 games, weeks of 23.6, 26.6, and 36 fantasy points. Weeks of 334, 235, 395, and 497 passing yards. 10 touchdowns and 7 interceptions during the span. If he can keep those turnovers low, we have a guy showing us tons of passing upside. I want to mention Parker Washington too. In Week 13, he caught 6 of 12 targets for 103 yards and a touchdown, 24.3 fantasy points. He's a sophomore. He could be growing into a bigger role because Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis are out the rest of the season, fantasy season. And when it gets cold out there, you can tell by my jacket, it's cuffing season heading into the fantasy football playoffs. Here are some running backs to consider stashing on your roster if you have the room.